Um, Thank you for all of your prayers for me and for my granny Amy. I know that she's comforted. We are all at peace. So thank you. Blessed would be an understatement for how I feel. Thank you. Open up your Bibles to the book of Nehemiah. We're going to spend all of our time in Nehemiah tonight. As we read in our scripture reading, in chapter 1 of Nehemiah, we see that Nehemiah is in exile, and he serves as cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. This is actually a very noble position to have. The cupbearer had to be able to make conversation with the king, noble, educated, probably attractive. The king wouldn't want anybody ugly around him, wouldn't look good for him. And so Nehemiah is a very well-educated person, has been observing what leadership looks like, and he's about to be a leader himself. In fact, in his prayer to God that we just read, he says in verse 11, "Give success to your servant today." And Nehemiah becomes a leader for a major project. Leaders have come throughout history many times. Steve Jobs, one of the people that is very iconic for his Apple products in his time, had exceptional marketing abilities. People took a document of Steve Jobs, of his marketing and his management, and from that they created movies and they created workshops based off his tools and his resources and his abilities to teach people how they could be better marketers and better managers and how they could be successful like Steve Jobs. And Jobs wasn't the only person that this has been done to. Anybody that's really depicted as successful becomes an icon to society. And when somebody becomes successful, then there's people that document it and they do all the data and the research. And they want other people to understand how they become successful. So they produce this data and this research so you can observe the big people and think, how do I mimic that ability? And how do I become successful like that? And so the middleman documents it and presents it. So tonight, we're going to take this and we're going to look at Nehemiah, a great leader, successful by God. We're going to study what he did to become a great leader and a godly man, and how we are going to mimic that to build our own wall. We're going to build a spiritual wall that's going to protect our hearts, our mind, and our soul. So tonight, let's look at Nehemiah's building blocks to success. Let's look at Nehemiah's building blocks on building a spiritual wall. Nehemiah's foundation. His first building block is obviously built on God. As we open the book in Nehemiah chapter 1, you see when Nehemiah hears of news of the destroyed Jerusalem and the burnt gates, the first person he goes to is God himself. The first person he turns to, and he pours out his heart in chapter 4 all the way to chapter 1 verse 4 all the way to verse 11. And he opens his prayer by praising God. And then he moves into a confession. I am your servant. We have wronged you, O Lord. My fathers have wronged you. But Lord, I pray, give success to your servant. Verse 11 says this, O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today. And grant him mercy in the sight of this man. And then he gives his position. I was cupbearer to the king. The first person that Nehemiah goes to is God. This is going to be the foundation for his success. He also knows that God is going to guide this project. If he's asking God for success from the very beginning, he knows who will guide it. And that's followed up in chapter 2 when Nehemiah presents the project to the people that will be working with it, and they're on board with it. Nehemiah says in chapter 2, in verse 20, he says this, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise and build. And the latter half of that verse will come later, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. But Nehemiah identifies from the beginning, it's God that's going to have this foundation. It's God that I'm working from. It's God that's going to give us a provision for everything that we need to do. This is God's project, and this is going to be for God's glory. The foundation, the first building block for Nehemiah's great leadership is he founds everything on God. Everything is built on God. The second element, the second building block of Nehemiah's successful leadership is his focus. He has a focus on auditing what needs to be taken care of. Look here in chapter 2, in verse 9. Nehemiah has been sent out from King Artaxerxes at this point. He asked by request, after having a sad face before the king as a cupbearer, the king asked, "What's wrong with you? It seems like you're experiencing some heartbreak here." And Nehemiah says, "My land is destroyed. The graves of my fathers, absolutely terrible, the condition it's in." And Artaxerxes says, "Well, what are you asking for?" And he says, "Please let me go and rebuild the wall." "How long are you going to be gone?" He tells him, "I'll be gone for a little bit, and please give me letters of passage and material so I can go and do this." And so Nehemiah is granted passage and permission by the king to go out and rebuild this wall. And first, Nehemiah had heard about what the condition of the wall was, and now he gets to experience it for himself. In chapter 2 and verse 11, Nehemiah is out with a company, but he goes off for a little bit by himself. Verse 11, "So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I rose in the night, and I, and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode, and I went by night by the valley of the gate to the dragon spring, to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down, and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. And then I went up I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall. And I turned back and entered the valley gate, and so returned." He's taking an audit. He's making an inspection. What's the project that needs to be done? We might have some work to do, but where am I starting from? God has commissioned this, but let's take an inspection of where we need to begin. And what he finds is absolute desolation, just like it was told to him. Verse 17 says this, "Then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in? How Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates are burned." He sees the ruins for himself. But he already has a foundation on God and a project that's been commissioned by God. And so he doesn't get turned away and discouraged. Actually, the rest of that verse says, "Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision." He's focusing on where the work needs to go from here, even when it starts in ruins. Even if there was nothing left there, as long as he himself had his foundation of God, he was going to build. His second focus was to restore. Obviously, he wants to restore the walls and the gates and everything. As we move into chapter 3, all of that gets taken care of. So he has one project of wanting to focus on restoring what has been torn down physically, but then there's another aspect that needs much more attention, and that is spiritual restoration. He's concerned about his own spiritual state and also the state of his brothers and his entire nation. In chapter 8 of Nehemiah, you see all of this happening when in chapter 8, Ezra reads the law to all of the people. They get reintroduced on what God desires between him and his people. And everybody gets to listen. What has God spoken to us? What has God commanded to us? What is it like to have a relationship with God? And then they reinstate the holy days. And by chapter 9, everybody wants to confess their sin, because they're going to also they're also going to restore the covenant that they once had with God. There's a focus on restoration for the wall, for the people, and for their relationship with God. And the last area, a very important area that Nehemiah is going to focus on, is ignoring everybody that wants to tear the wall down. In Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 9, we get introduced to two problems that are going to be problems throughout this entire book. Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 9 says, "Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river, and I gave them the king's letters." This is while he's on his way to Jerusalem. "Now the king had sent me with me officers of the army and horsemen, but when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servants heard it, they were displeased, and they were greatly displeased that someone had come to seek the welfare and the people of Israel. And since they were displeased from the beginning, they will be displeased till the very end. And not just displeased, but they start making fun of everybody." In verse 19 of chapter 2, it says this: the people are inspired. It says, "Let us rise up and build." So they strengthen their hands for the good work. And then we get into verse 19. "But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite, the same servants of Geshem the Arab, heard it, they jeered at us. And they despised us and said, 'What is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king?' This went from being annoyed to being aggressive and accusing them of rebelling. And then in chapter 4, they begin to rebel even more, and they begin to push back even more against Nehemiah, who's trying to build this wall, and really make fun of them. In verse 2 of chapter 4, this is Sanballat that's saying, in the presence of the brothers in the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burnt ones at that?" Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him and said, "Yes, what are they building? If a fox goes up on the wall, it will break it down. Their stone wall will be broken down." This continues on, and it gets worse and worse to the point where Tobiah actually hires some of Nehemiah's fellows to try to kill him, to try to lure him into the temple, to take his life away from him. All of this is going on. From the beginning, they want to see the wall fall down, but from the beginning, Nehemiah wasn't going to stop. He's focused on rebuilding and finishing the wall. He's focused on the project that God had started and is going to provide for. And he's also focused on ignoring everybody that's going to try to lead him away from the very project that he's working on by God. The focus of Nehemiah, where are we starting from? What's the problem? Let's focus on restoring, and let's focus on ignoring those that want to stop this project and keep this wall from being built. Our third level of bricks, our third building block, is accountability. One of Nehemiah's great elements as a leader is accountability, and he's accountable, as he realizes, as he himself is accountable to God. As I was talking before, when Sanballat and Tobiah are trying to work against Nehemiah and lead him into the temple, this is what happens in that. Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 10. "Now when he went out into the house of Shemaiah, the son Delaiah, son of Mehetabel, who was confined to his home, he said, 'Let us meet together in the house of God within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. They are coming to kill you by night.' But I said, 'Should such a man as I run away? And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in.' And I understood and saw that God had not sent him, but he had pronounced the prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him." Nehemiah knows he's accountable to God and what his position is, where he stands before God. He knows that his actions will be remembered by God for what he does. He also understands that his entire nation is accountable to God. As we saw, when they wanted to restore their relationship with God, they began to confess everything that they've done. They want a covenant again with God. And Nehemiah is going to help them have this covenant. And he's going to give them direction about what they need to do to restore their relationship with God and to maintain it. And he also assigns the priests to do the same thing. And he reminds the priests, you're accountable to God also, and you're going to have to take charge over these people. In Nehemiah chapter 10, there's all of these priests listed out that seal this letter. In chapter 10, verse 28 said, the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all who had separated themselves from the peoples of the land to the law of God. To the law of God. They knew who they belonged to and who they were accountable to. Everybody did. And he also understands that his enemies are accountable to God. Back in Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse 14, says this, and I looked and arose. Oh, excuse me, that was chapter 4. Chapter 6, verse 14. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat? Oh my God, according to these things that they did, and also the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid. Everybody is accountable to God, and Nehemiah understands that. The people are blessed to have Nehemiah as somebody that's holding them accountable. This is a building block because look what happens when nobody holds anybody accountable for anything. And it happens in chapter 13. Nehemiah has helped them build the wall, finish the wall. God has helped them finish the wall, and Nehemiah knows it, and the rest of the nation see that the wall was done and done well and so quickly that they can't help but glorify God and say God must have helped them, and they're afraid of them. Nehemiah has helped them restore a relationship with God, made the land well, and this is what happens when Nehemiah has done all of this and God has made him successful. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 6. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And after some time I asked leave of the king, and came to Jerusalem, and then I discovered the evil that Elishabib had done for Tobiah. You remember Tobiah, the one that was working against him? The one that hired somebody else, one of Nehemiah's own people, to try to lure him into the temple? The one that's been a problem this entire time? This is what happens when Nehemiah leaves. Tobiah had a room prepared for him in the chamber, in the courts, in the house of God. Sin has already begun to creep back in, and this is how Nehemiah deals with it. Verse 8, and I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. And this is just the beginning. Sin has crept in this way. They've let the enemy come in and dwell within their own courts. They've let the enemy make a room among themselves, and everything falls apart. They won't keep the Sabbath. They're marrying into unlawful marriages. They're doing everything that they shouldn't have done, and as soon as Nehemiah leaves and there is no accountability, they just welcome all sin back into their life. But as soon as Nehemiah comes back, he holds everybody accountable for what they've done because he knows that everybody is accountable to God. And he starts kicking sin out left and right. Get it out of here. Get it away from me. This is why Nehemiah is a great leader. He knows his foundation is on God. He has a great focus. He understands accountability for everybody, including himself. And all of this is held together by prayer. Nehemiah is a prayer warrior. He could have the focus and the accountability, but these are glued together by prayer. These are held together because of his relationship with God. From the beginning of the book, as soon as he's in distress, he turns to God and pours his heart out. There's different prayers that happen throughout Nehemiah, and the first one is this pouring out of his heart and his concern to God. It's kind of like when Hezekiah received threatening letters, he took the letters and he spread all of the letters out before God, and he also poured his heart out and prayed. But this doesn't consistently happen throughout the book of Nehemiah. Actually, Nehemiah's prayer life is sprinkled in every trouble that he comes across. He's standing before Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes confronts him, and he sends up a quick prayer in chapter 2. Oh God, help me. And that's all we know. And God helps him. Grants him the first step of success, opening the door to Artaxerxes' resources and granting him permission. And all of these little prayers continue to take place throughout the book. There's 7 of them. An enemy comes near. Lord, help me. Lord, remember them. Lord, strengthen our hands. All the way to the close of the book. The last words of Nehemiah is a prayer. Remember me, oh my God, for good. Nehemiah knew it was important to stay in contact with the one that started this project, commissioned this project, provided for this project. And it didn't just start with one prayer and it stopped. He had a continual prayer life, constant contact. And it probably moved beyond just a prayer here and a prayer there or times of prayer, but a constant communication throughout the day with God. The focus may have been there, but without constant communication, the focus may have faded away if he hadn't continued to remember who he was doing this for and with. The accountability could have been there, but without constant communication with the one they were accountable to, the accountability may have faded away. The prayer glued focus and accountability all together, and it's all concrete with God. So Nehemiah's elements of success, his building blocks of success, his foundation was God. It didn't matter if he was going to start this project from ruins or from nothing. He was focused. He was focused on what God wanted, and he was focused on finishing the job to the end. He was accountable. He held everybody accountable, including himself. And as soon as sin crept in, he made it known that sin had to go right away. And all of this was glued together by prayer. If we want to build a spiritual wall to protect our soul, to protect our minds, protect our hearts in the world, to keep the enemy out, we have the very building blocks that we need to do that, to build that spiritual defense. And the foundation is laid on God. God is going to help you build a defense against sin. He's going to lay it out. You build on that. And it doesn't matter if you're going to start from ruins or start from nothing. If you want a strong spiritual wall, you can start building on God. You want to focus on building that wall. You want to focus on finishing it. You want to focus on ignoring the naysayers because they'll come out. Satan will try to attack you when you're trying to build up a good spiritual life. And he'll try to tear it down. And he'll try to discourage you from continuing to build. But don't be discouraged. Ignore the lies of Satan. If you want a strong spiritual wall, it takes accountability. Everybody is accountable to God. As soon as sin creeps in, it's time to kick sin out. If sin gets in, you can't let it live there or it multiplies. And this will all be glued together with prayer, the mortar for the building blocks. Constant communication with God who's building your wall and building your spiritual defense. It'll move beyond just a prayer here and a prayer there until it's constant contact and constant communication with the Lord throughout the day. That's how you build a spiritual wall and a spiritual defense. This is how Nehemiah built a physical wall. His foundation was God. He was focused. He had accountability. and it was all glued together with prayer. I challenge you today on your foundation with God to take an audit of what needs to be built up. Take an audit, an inventory of where you might be lacking in your spiritual life. This is for me too. Understand that we are accountable, and we're accountable to our sin to kick it out and become a prayer warrior constantly. And you'll see that your wall is very, very strong and almost impenetrable, especially if it's built on God. The lesson is yours this evening. If you're subject to the invitation call, you can come forward or make yourself known, and you can be baptized into Jesus Christ for the remission of your sins. The wall that's between you and God can be torn down, and you can be joined with him through Christ. Or if you're going through hard times and you need prayer, we can be the glue, the mortar of prayer together as we reach out to God constantly, who builds us back up. Won't you let your need be made known as we stand and sing our invitation song?